It begins, as many stories do, with silence. An absence louder than words, more unsettling than noise. Not the quiet of peace, but of something missing. A voice silenced, a truth undone. We tend to believe that truth, like water, finds its way. That if something is important enough, it will rise, despite resistance, despite power. But history, especially the hidden kind, tells a different tale. What happens when the people holding the keys to uncomfortable truths about medicine, money, technology, or control die before they can speak? This is not a story about conspiracy. It is a story about patterns. Patterns in silence, in timing, in death. Over the course of this journey, we will explore the final days of 10 people, billionaires, scientists, innovators, and journalists, whose deaths were not just tragic, but haunting in their implications. These were not ordinary individuals. They were insiders, people with rare access to the deepest systems that run our world, from pharmaceutical empires and black-budget surveillance programs to energy monopolies and data control mechanisms. Each of them was on the verge of revealing something. A report, a testimony, a software release. Then, gone. What connects these deaths isn't simply their prominence or the suspicious circumstances. It's what was lost with them: information, insight, and often the possibility of change. Take Barry and Honey Sherman, found hanging beside their indoor pool, wrists tied, hours before Barry was due to testify about pharmaceutical price fixing. Or Aaron Swartz, the digital freedom prodigy, who uncovered mass surveillance before it became a household term, found dead before his reveal. These aren't ghost stories, they're puzzles, evidence-based anomalies with official narratives that rarely hold. As we travel through their stories, we'll ask, is there a mechanism, silent, unseen, that ensures certain truths never surface? Are these deaths isolated tragedies or part of a systemic phenomenon? And most importantly, why do some truths seem to require blood as a toll? We live in an age where data flows freely, yet meaning is often controlled, where whistleblowers are simultaneously hailed and hunted, and where power, real systemic power, rarely wears a name tag. So this series is not about proving any singular theory. It's about opening a space for possibility, for empathy, for questioning the stories we're given, and the stories we're not. Because in the end, the greatest danger may not be in what's hidden. It may lie in what we've stopped looking for. Welcome to a journey through silence, death, and the secrets that vanished with them. This is not a story of how they died. This is a story of what died with them. It started with the sharp scent of chlorine and the kind of stillness that feels deliberate. December 15, 2017. Barry and Honey Sherman, a billionaire couple known for their philanthropy and pharmaceutical empire, were found lifeless beside the pool in their Toronto mansion. They were posed upright, side by side, wrists bound, hanging from belts looped over a poolside railing. To some, it looked like a grisly tableau. To others, a message. Police first called it a murder-suicide. But those who knew the Shermans, family, colleagues, forensic analysts, knew better. There were no signs of psychological distress, no notes, no history of marital issues. And the physical evidence? It didn't match the narrative. Barry Sherman wasn't just a wealthy man, he was a disruptor. As the founder of Apotex, he'd built one of the world's largest generic drug companies by slashing prices, often undercutting brand-name medications by up to 90%. His work made medicine more affordable for millions, but also earned him powerful enemies. For years, he received death threats. Competitors accused him of destabilizing the industry. And just weeks before his death, he had submitted evidence to Canadian regulators, evidence that exposed a wide-reaching price-fixing conspiracy involving pharmaceutical giants, insurers, and even public officials. He was preparing to testify before Parliament. What he had in his possession could have triggered criminal charges against some of the most powerful companies in the world. Then he died. Private investigators hired by the family uncovered chilling details. The Shermans had been restrained and likely tortured before death. Autopsy results, initially sealed, revealed compression patterns inconsistent with hanging. Surveillance footage vanished. Key witnesses were silenced. And most notably, within 48 hours of Barry's scheduled testimony, the case was no longer being handled by homicide detectives. It had been reassigned to financial crimes. Evidence disappeared. Leads went cold. Was it a coincidence, or was it convenience? Analysts estimate that Sherman's revelations could have cost the pharmaceutical industry over $50 billion in fines and settlements. Instead, the case faded into bureaucratic limbo. A few headlines, a closed investigation, and then nothing. What remains is not only a loss of life, but the silencing of a man on the cusp of challenging an entire industry. And with his silence came a larger one. A silence that rippled through boardrooms, institutions, and communities that depend on affordable medicine. If Barry Sherman had lived another 48 hours, how different might the conversation around pharmaceutical pricing be today? What systems would have been exposed? What safeguards could have been put in place? We will never know. But perhaps the more haunting question is this: when the threat of truth becomes too costly, how far will power go to protect itself? In the stillness of that poolside scene, we are left with a chilling possibility, not just that Barry and Honey Sherman were murdered, but that their deaths were an erasure, not only of two people, but of a reckoning that never came. August 10th, 2019, a prison cell in Manhattan. A man with too many secrets and not enough time. Jeffrey Epstein was found dead that morning, a bedsheet wrapped around his neck, slumped in the corner of his high-security cell. The official ruling? Suicide. But from the very first moment, something about that conclusion rang hollow. Epstein wasn't just another inmate. He was the keeper of names, an orchestrator of shadows. For decades, he'd cultivated a network of power, wealth, and silence. His private island, nicknamed Pedophile Island, had become the unholy meeting ground for the world's elite. Inside its lavish walls, hidden cameras, secret rooms, and years of incriminating footage. He wasn't merely a criminal. He was an archivist of compromise. His black book brimmed with contact information for presidents, royalty, CEOs, and celebrities. Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, tech moguls, Hollywood power brokers, they were all there. And Epstein had begun to talk. 2 weeks before his death, he had agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors in exchange for protective custody. His attorneys said he was hopeful, focused, preparing a defense built not on denial, but revelation. Then, in a single night, every security measure meant to protect him failed. The surveillance cameras outside his cell stopped working. Guards who were supposed to check on him every 30 minutes fell asleep at the same time. His cellmate was mysteriously transferred hours earlier. And most strikingly, his suicide watch, ordered just days before, was lifted without explanation. The autopsy told a different story: multiple fractures in the neck, including a broken hyoid bone, an injury far more consistent with strangulation than hanging. Blood patterns and ligature marks that didn't align with the official story, and a timeline of events that unraveled under scrutiny. Then came the raids. Within hours of Epstein's death, the FBI seized computers, hard drives, and thousands of photos from his homes. Materials believed to contain damning evidence of high-profile abuse, financial crimes, and blackmail. Yet nothing was ever released, nothing confirmed. The data vanished into sealed files, guarded under the veil of national security. And just like that, the single man who could have unraveled a web of global corruption was gone. It wasn't only a death. It was a closing of the gates. Some called it an accident, others justice delayed, but to many it felt like a controlled demolition. the quiet snuffing of a fuse that threatened to detonate institutions across the world. Epstein's death didn't just protect individuals. It preserved systems, networks built on secrets, power structures invisible to the public eye, but deeply embedded in our society. And so we're left with a haunting question. What happens when the blackmail file dies with its owner? In a world that prides itself on transparency and justice, are there some truths simply too dangerous to surface? In Epstein's silence, many found confirmation. Not of any single theory, but of a deep, unsettling truth. That power protects itself. And sometimes all it takes is one prison door, closed just long enough for the truth to be buried along with the man who held it. June 23, 2021. A Spanish prison cell. A lifeless body dangling from torn bedsheets. The man was John McAfee, software magnate, cryptocurrency evangelist, and digital outlaw. To some, he was a madman. To others, a prophet of the digital age. But above all, McAfee was a man who refused to be silenced. Just hours earlier, a court had approved his extradition to the United States, where he faced charges of tax evasion. But McAfee claimed it was never about taxes. He believed they wanted him not for what he'd done, but for what he knew. In the weeks before his death, McAfee spoke frequently about a dead man's switch, an automated data drop that would unleash a flood of incriminating documents if anything happened to him. He said it would expose government surveillance programs, financial manipulation, and digital warfare strategies hidden from public view. McAfee had always lived on the edge of chaos, but in those final months, he seemed certain of one thing: he was being hunted. He alleged that his antivirus software had been repurposed by intelligence agencies to monitor billions of devices globally. He warned that major governments were not just watching citizens, they were shaping economies through covert manipulation of cryptocurrency markets. In his words, the blockchain wasn't just money, it was the battlefield. He was building something new, a decentralized communication system immune to surveillance, a tool for financial and informational freedom. If successful, it could have rewritten the rules of digital control. Then he died. Prison authorities called it suicide, but fellow inmates told a different story. They heard shouting, struggle, multiple voices in the corridor, surveillance footage gone, corrupted, they said. The body cremated within 48 hours. No independent autopsy, no second opinions. And the most chilling detail, within minutes of McAfee's death being announced, all of his secure servers went offline, simultaneously, as if someone had been waiting. The dead man's switch never activated. Those who had followed his warnings were left stunned. Was it all bluster? Or had someone, somewhere, preempted the release? What McAfee left behind was not clarity, but a vacuum. A space filled with doubt, with questions too large for any one answer. Was he silenced for what he planned to release, or for what he already had? John McAfee had always been unpredictable, part genius, part provocateur. But in a world increasingly defined by data and control, his death raised a larger specter, that those who challenge the architectures of surveillance may never live to see their warnings heard. What do we lose when the chaotic voices vanish? Perhaps the real danger lies not in the secrets themselves, but in the systems determined to keep them hidden. McAfee once said, "If I'm ever found dead, it wasn't suicide." And in the quiet aftermath of his final tweet, the world was left wondering if he was right. The morning of December 8, 2020, sunlight crept across the hills of Santa Barbara, California. But inside one quiet home, something was terribly wrong. Dr. Brandy Vaughn, a former pharmaceutical executive turned outspoken vaccine safety advocate, was found dead. No signs of forced entry. No apparent struggle. Just stillness and a life cut short. To the world, she had become a lightning rod, brilliant, controversial, and relentlessly focused on exposing what she believed was a dangerous suppression of truth within the pharmaceutical industry. Years earlier, she had worked inside one of the world's largest drug companies. And what she saw there changed her forever. She claimed to have uncovered internal documents showing that serious vaccine side effects were known, documented, discussed, but buried. Safety studies manipulated. Regulators swayed. Public trust, she warned, had been built on a house of mirrors. Brandy left the industry and began a mission: to inform, to question, to challenge. She founded Learn the Risk, a grassroots organization that grew rapidly. Her talks filled auditoriums. Her videos went viral. Parents, doctors, and curious minds tuned in. Not because she promised certainty, but because she asked the questions others wouldn't. And then came the warnings. Brandy reported strange break-ins, nothing stolen, but personal items moved, death threats, anonymous, unnerving. Vehicles parked outside her house for hours at a time. She documented everything, posted videos, wrote letters. "If anything happens to me," she said more than once, "it's not suicide." She was healthy, active, engaged with her son's life. She had just published new research and was preparing to testify in a major lawsuit. Then, without warning, she was gone. The coroner ruled it a natural cardiac event, rare, unexplained, and despite no history of heart issues. Requests for a second autopsy were denied. Toxicology results? Inconclusive. Her family and supporters were left not only grieving, but grappling with what felt like an erasure. Within days, her website vanished. Social media accounts deleted. Years of research and outreach wiped clean from public view. What was she trying to share that so many seemed desperate to silence? Brandy's story isn't just about vaccines or one woman's mission. It's about something deeper. What happens when someone inside the machine turns around and says, "Something's wrong"? Her voice echoed in a space few dared enter, not claiming universal answers, but insisting on the right to ask hard questions. And perhaps that's the most dangerous position of all. In the days after her death, many of her supporters clung to a single question: was this a warning to others? A deterrent not of violence, but of fear? Brandy Vaughn believed in light, in bringing things into the open, in truth wherever it led. And now, with her voice silenced, we are left with her final haunting request: investigate everything. December 31st, 2010, the final day of the year. Somewhere amid the cold winds of Delaware, a garbage truck made its rounds, never knowing it carried a corpse. John Wheeler III was found in a landfill, his body crumpled beneath layers of waste. It was a grotesque and puzzling end for a man who had once walked the halls of the Pentagon, advised presidents, and helped shape America's defense policies. To the outside world, Wheeler was an esteemed veteran, a decorated officer, a consultant to powerful defense contractors. But toward the end of his life, he had turned his attention to something else, something darker. He had begun investigating irregularities in Pentagon budgets, specifically in defense contracts. According to close contacts, Wheeler had uncovered evidence that billions in taxpayer funds were being funneled into secret offshore accounts. Shell companies, phantom transactions. The trail pointed to a complex laundering operation involving major banks and defense contractors, perhaps even intelligence agencies. He was preparing to go public, not with rumors, but with documents, emails, internal memos, a trove of proof. Then, just days before his scheduled meetings with congressional investigators, Wheeler's behavior changed. He told friends he was being watched, that someone was listening to his calls. He was seen wandering through parking garages, disoriented. At least, that's how the reports described it. But his family insisted this was not confusion. This was fear. His body, when recovered, showed signs of blunt force trauma. Not the kind one sustains from a fall, but the kind that comes from fists. Or worse. There were no clear answers about how he ended up in a landfill, no security footage, no witnesses, just questions and silence. The police suggested no foul play, no charges were filed, and quietly, almost imperceptibly, the investigation Wheeler had been supporting was shut down. The prosecutors reassigned. The documents he'd compiled, seized by federal agents, classified. What does it mean when someone with top-level clearance, deep institutional knowledge, and a moral compass becomes a liability? And what does it mean when that person disappears, discarded like refuse? John Wheeler's death barely made the news. A few headlines, a few days, then gone. But in the shadows of bureaucracy and finance, his case remains one of the most chilling. Because it suggests something profound, that systems meant to protect public interest can be turned against those who defend it. He wasn't a whistleblower in the traditional sense. He was an insider, a believer in the system, until the system swallowed him whole. When institutions become too large to confront and truth becomes too dangerous to speak, where does one turn? In a landfill in Delaware, that question remains unanswered, and the man who might have told us why is no longer here to speak. January 11th, 2013. A Brooklyn apartment. Quiet. Too quiet for someone whose mind rarely rested. Aaron Swartz, 26 years old. Programmer. Activist. Visionary. Found dead by his own hand, or so the report said. But those who knew Aaron remember a man full of fight, not fear. A builder of open systems. A challenger of closed doors. He had already changed the internet once, helping to create RSS, co-founding Reddit, and becoming a fierce advocate for free knowledge. But Aaron's true passion wasn't code, it was justice. Not just in law, but in access, in truth. At the time of his death, Aaron was under federal indictment. His alleged crime? Downloading academic articles from a subscription database, JSTOR, with the intent to make them freely available. But the charges were outsized. Decades of prison time loomed. The pressure was relentless. What most didn't know was that Aaron was also on the verge of revealing something far more explosive. Research that delved into how technology companies were quietly enabling mass surveillance. His work had uncovered how governments, with the help of private platforms, were watching not just terrorists but ordinary citizens, reading emails, tracking purchases, mapping social networks. He wasn't just theorizing. He had documents, proof, and he planned to release them at a major tech conference just weeks later. But he never made it. His family and friends pushed back on the suicide narrative. Yes, he was under pressure, but he was hopeful, even excited, about what he was building. They questioned the suddenness, the lack of context, and most of all, they questioned the silence that followed. After his death, the materials he had compiled, research notes, drives, conference drafts, disappeared, seized, never returned. The message, whether intentional or not, was clear. There are lines you don't cross, even when your cause is knowledge, even when your tool is a keyboard. Aaron's death hit a generation like a thunderclap. It wasn't just the loss of a gifted thinker. It was the loss of possibility, the sense that the internet could be a force for liberation, not control. In the years that followed, many of his warnings proved prescient. Revelations from whistleblowers echoed the very concerns Aaron had been chasing. But he didn't live to see the vindication. He once wrote, "Information is power, but like all power, there are those who want to keep it for themselves." Aaron wanted to break that cycle, to shine light into locked vaults. And for that, the system came crashing down on him. Was it prosecution or persecution? What would he have revealed had he lived? We don't know. We may never know. But the silence left in his wake is deafening. And the fight he began for open knowledge, for transparency, for dignity in a digital age continues, carried by those who still believe that truth should not come with a price tag or a funeral. July 11, 1994, Monterey, California. A man lay dying from what was described as a fall at a local bar. But those who knew Gary Kildall knew something didn't add up. He was no ordinary man. Gary Kildall was a pioneer, one of the original architects of the personal computer revolution. Long before Windows became a household name, it was Kildall who created CP/M, one of the first operating systems for microcomputers. But he wasn't just a tech visionary. In his later years, he became obsessed with a different kind of code, one that could change the way we power the world. Kildall had turned his attention to energy, more specifically, to how software could decentralize it. He envisioned smart grids that would allow homes and communities to trade renewable energy peer-to-peer. No utility companies, no central control. Just clean energy flowing where it was needed most, managed by algorithms and shared by everyone. It wasn't just innovative, it was revolutionary. Because if energy could be shared like information, the monopolies that controlled electricity, oil, and gas would face an existential threat. And they knew it. Kildall refused to sell. He believed his work should be open source, free to the world. But as interest grew, so did the pressure. Then, one night, he suffered a head injury. Officially, it was an accident. He fell, they said. But witnesses described strange men in suits following him. A quiet altercation. And after his death, more questions than answers. The medical examiner's report raised concerns. The injuries didn't align with a single fall. There were signs of multiple impacts. Blunt force, possible assault, no arrests, no deeper inquiry. And within days, something else happened. His lab was broken into, but not vandalized. It was targeted. Every computer holding his energy software was stolen. Not sold, not leaked, just gone. It was a surgical strike, clean, precise, silent. What could Kildall's technology have done had it survived? Could neighborhoods have become energy sovereign? Could it have broken the chains of fossil fuel dependence? We'll never know. In a world powered by scarcity, manufactured or real, Kildall's vision posed a threat too great to be ignored. He wanted to democratize energy the way he once helped democratize computing. Instead, his legacy became a whisper. Gary Kildall rarely sought the spotlight, but in the quiet corners of history, he may have stood closer to the future than most ever realized. And in losing him, we may have lost a pathway to a freer, cleaner world, buried under the weight of silence and the protection of profit. June 18, 2013. The streets of Los Angeles were still dark in the early morning hours when Michael Hastings' car veered off the road, slammed into a tree, and exploded in a blaze so fierce it melted the engine block. The 33-year-old investigative journalist was dead. To the world, Hastings was a bold truth-teller, unafraid to confront power, unflinching in his pursuit of what lay beneath the surface. He had taken down generals, challenged intelligence agencies, and exposed military missteps in Iraq and Afghanistan. His reporting was the kind that made enemies. But what he was working on before his death may have been his most dangerous story yet. Sources close to Hastings confirmed that he had been investigating a sophisticated network of media manipulation, how intelligence agencies were working with major news outlets and social media platforms to quietly shape public perception. Not just to influence opinion, but to engineer it. Operation Mockingbird, the old CIA program that once placed intelligence assets in newsrooms, had evolved. Hastings believed it had gone digital, blending covert propaganda with cutting-edge algorithms, artificial intelligence, bot networks, controlled narratives disguised as grassroots opinion. He had the names, the documents. The story was nearly ready. And then came the final hours. Just before the crash, Hastings sent an email to his colleagues. He wrote that he was onto something big, that he was being watched, and that he needed to go off the radar for a bit. That night, his car accelerated to nearly 100 miles per hour in a residential area, without explanation. No skid marks, no evidence of braking, no mechanical failure. The explosion was so violent that witnesses thought it was a bomb. Some cybersecurity experts speculated, could the car have been hacked? Could its systems have been remotely accessed? Modern vehicles, after all, are computers on wheels. Within days, federal agents seized his work materials, citing national security. The article he had promised was never published. And the research? Gone. Hastings' death was ruled an accident, a tragic, fiery crash. But for those who followed his work, the timing was too perfect, the silence too complete. What happens when the media stops watching the powerful and starts working for them? That was the question Hastings had begun to ask. He believed journalism should be adversarial, that the role of the press was to hold power accountable, not act as its echo. He died believing that democracy depends not on polished headlines, but on uncomfortable truths. And if his final story had reached the public, it might have revealed a machinery of influence operating quietly behind our screens, shaping what we believe and what we never even think to question. Michael Hastings didn't just report stories. He challenged systems. And in doing so, he may have stumbled too close to one that didn't want to be seen. In the smoldering wreckage of that car, perhaps something else died too, the chance to understand just how deep the influence runs. November 13, 1974. A narrow stretch of highway outside Crescent, Oklahoma. The car was mangled, crumpled into a concrete culvert. Inside was Karen Silkwood, dead at 28. She had been on her way to meet a journalist, carrying a folder of documents that could have changed everything. Silkwood wasn't a household name. She was a lab technician at the Kerr-McGee plutonium processing plant, quietly working long shifts in a facility that supplied fuel for the nuclear industry. But over time, she saw too much. Records that didn't add up. Safety protocols ignored. Contamination incidents buried under paperwork. She became a union activist, then a whistleblower. What she found was chilling. Plutonium dust in places it shouldn't be. Falsified safety logs. Workers, herself included, exposed to levels of radiation that could scar them for life. And behind it all, a company willing to risk lives for profit, with regulators who looked the other way. But Karen wasn't quiet about it. She testified before the Atomic Energy Commission. She spoke out, and when that wasn't enough, she gathered documents, internal memos, safety violations, proof. That night, she told friends she had what she needed. The documents were in a folder beside her on the passenger seat. She never made it to the meeting. When police found her car, they said she fell asleep at the wheel. No skid marks, no sign of braking, just impact. But her car had unusual dents, paint from another vehicle, tire marks suggesting she'd been forced off the road. And the folder? Gone. No trace. No papers at the scene. The very documents that could have exposed one of the worst environmental cover-ups of its time had vanished. The case was closed. No foul play, no further questions. But what Silkwood uncovered didn't disappear. Others picked up the trail. Lawsuits followed. Investigations. Eventually, Kerr-McGee shuttered its nuclear operations. But the human toll remained, illnesses, cancers, and the lingering sense that truth had come at too high a cost. Karen Silkwood became a symbol, not just of whistleblowing, but of the personal cost of speaking out. She had no platform, no fame, no wealth, just a belief that people had a right to know what was being done in their name and in their bodies, and for that she may have been silenced. Her story asks us, what is the value of a life measured against the secrets it holds? And when someone dares to confront systems designed to be opaque, how far will those systems go to ensure the silence remains? In the stillness of that crash scene, we are left with more than wreckage. We are left with a void where truth might have lived, and a reminder that sometimes it's not power that kills. It's the fear of what truth might undo. June 19, 2015. The green waters of the Rocky Broad River, North Carolina. Floating face down, a single body. Dr. Jeff Bradstreet. A gunshot wound to the chest. The official story: suicide. But for those who followed his work, that explanation felt like the beginning of a deeper mystery. Bradstreet wasn't just a doctor. He was a fierce and sometimes controversial voice in the world of autism research. His clinic treated thousands of children with alternative therapies that challenged mainstream narratives about the causes and possible treatments of autism. His research focused on heavy metals, immune responses, and inflammation. He questioned the safety of vaccine ingredients and published peer-reviewed studies suggesting a connection between certain additives and neurological harm. Most controversially, he explored a protein called nagalussy, which he believed was interfering with the body's natural ability to fight disease. Bradstreet didn't say these things lightly. He backed them with data, with clinical results, with a passionate community of parents who believed his therapies were helping their children in ways conventional medicine hadn't. Then federal agents raided his clinic. Just days later, he was dead. Authorities claimed he'd driven hundreds of miles, walked into the woods, and shot himself in the chest. But the trajectory of the bullet was unusual. On the left side, despite Bradstreet being right-handed. No weapon was ever conclusively linked to the scene, and forensic analysts hired by the family questioned whether a self-inflicted shot under those conditions was even plausible. Within months, several other doctors researching similar therapies also died. Accidents, disappearances, unexplained causes. The pattern unsettled even the skeptics. More chilling was the digital erasure that followed. Bradstreet's research files, patient records, and online content began to vanish. His clinic's website shut down. Social media accounts were scrubbed. Years of data gone. To his supporters, it wasn't just a loss, it was a dismantling. A rollback of the very questions he had spent his life asking. Why would someone with plans, with patience, with a family, someone actively fighting to defend his work, simply give up? And if he was wrong, if his research was flawed, why not let it stand and be challenged in open debate? Bradstreet's story isn't just about medicine. It's about control, of narratives, of science, of dissent. In a time when public health has become a battleground of belief and data, his death left a void filled with fear, not clarity. Was he a visionary silenced for what he might prove? Or a casualty of his own convictions? The answer may lie not just in what was lost, but in what we weren't allowed to see. Because when ideas threaten profit, when questions challenge authority, it is often not just the science that gets buried, it's the scientist. In the warm light of a spring morning, the world lost another voice, one that few remember, but one whose absence echoes louder with each passing year. Gary Webb, investigative journalist, relentless, fearless, found dead in 2004 with 2 gunshot wounds to the head, ruled a suicide. He isn't part of this list by accident. His name is a symbol of what it means to confront an empire of denial with only a pen, and to lose everything for it. Webb's reporting in the 1990s uncovered a story so explosive that it shook the American consciousness. He traced how cocaine flooded into poor U.S. neighborhoods in the 1980s, and how that pipeline had direct connections to CIA-backed rebel groups in Central America. His series, Dark Alliance, connected the dots between U.S. intelligence operations and the devastating crack epidemic in black communities. The story made waves. Public outcry followed, but so did the pushback. Mainstream media outlets turned on him. Editors distanced themselves. His career unraveled. He was mocked, discredited, and blacklisted from major publications. But Webb never recanted. He stood by his work, and years later, declassified documents confirmed many of his central claims. Quietly, without apology, he spent his final years writing, struggling financially, taking freelance gigs far beneath his experience. Then one day, he was found dead. 2 gunshots to the head, from his own gun. It was ruled a suicide, despite the improbability. Friends questioned the narrative. Some pointed to threats he had received, others to the pattern of targeting those who exposed intelligence activities. But beyond the cause of death lies a deeper wound. Webb died after being silenced, not just by a bullet, but by the crushing weight of institutional denial. His legacy is not just in the pages he wrote, but in the silence that followed them. Because for every brave story he uncovered, there were many more that never reached the surface, buried under bureaucratic pressure, editorial fear, and the quiet understanding that some truths are too dangerous to print. He once said, "The official story is never the real story." And perhaps that's what connects all these lives we've explored. Each of them was on the verge of telling a different story, a truer one that could have changed how we understand the world. But they didn't get the chance. In the end, Gary Webb's death, like the others, reminds us that journalism, science, activism, invention, they are not protected by truth alone. In fact, truth often paints a target. And in that quiet place between what we're told and what we suspect, there lingers a question. How many more voices have been lost to the darkness they tried to expose? And how many more will we ignore before we finally listen? They called it the insurance file. A digital time bomb set to go off if its keeper vanished, encrypted, redundant, spread across the web like invisible seeds waiting for the right moment to bloom. It belonged to John McAfee, but he wasn't the only one. In the final years of their lives, more than one figure in our story prepared for the worst. A dead man's switch, a last defense, a whisper from the grave meant to outlive the body. And yet, time after time, the files never appeared. The servers went dark. The evidence vanished. Why? Whether it was Brandy Vaughn's archived research, Aaron Swartz's unreleased conference materials, or Michael Hastings' final article, something always intervened. Technology failed. Access was blocked. Silence replaced revelation. Some blame shadowy actors with advanced capabilities. Others suspect internal sabotage. But the result is the same. The trail ends before the truth begins. This chapter is not about a single person. It is about the mechanisms of suppression, how power doesn't always need to fire a bullet to kill a story. Sometimes it only needs to pull a plug, or discredit a voice, or erase a hard drive before it boots. Because in the digital age, silencing someone isn't just about ending a life. It's about making it as though their message never existed. Think about that. How many unspoken truths lie buried not in cemeteries, but in obsolete file formats, disconnected servers, or hard drives quietly destroyed? In theory, information wants to be free. But in practice, freedom depends on networks, social, technical, and human. And when those networks fail, truth becomes fragile. We tell ourselves the internet remembers everything, that once something is uploaded, it lives forever. But it's a myth. Servers are seized, domains expire, passwords are lost. And without someone to fight for it, even the most explosive truth can vanish without a trace. What would those lost files have shown us? Would they have exposed corruption in medicine or manipulation in markets? Would they have held proof of surveillance or revealed the architecture of modern propaganda? We may never know. And yet the pattern itself tells a story of interference, of intentional forgetting, of powerful forces not just reacting to threats, but anticipating them, and neutralizing them before they spark. In that sense, the absence of information becomes a kind of presence, an echo of what could have been, a phantom limb of lost possibility. So when we ask why the dead man's switches didn't work, perhaps we should also ask, what kind of world have we built where the final fail-safe for truth is a whisper from beyond the grave? And what will it take to build one where the truth doesn't need to die to be heard? In the end, it isn't just the deaths that haunt us. It's the silence that follows. Barry Sherman, Jeffrey Epstein, John McAfee, Brandy Vaughn, John Wheeler, Aaron Swartz, Gary Kildall, Michael Hastings, Karen Silkwood, Jeff Bradstreet. Each one stood at the edge of revelation, and each one vanished before the truth could surface. We began this journey with a question. What happens when powerful people threaten to expose the invisible systems that govern medicine, money, media, energy, and control? Now we are left with a more unsettling one. What if there is a pattern? Not a conspiracy in the cinematic sense, with secret meetings and shadowy villains, but something more systemic, more silent, a culture of suppression, a structure of incentives where uncomfortable truths are quietly erased and the public over time learns not to ask. Each of these stories points to something unfinished. A missing report, a silenced voice, a final message that never arrived. And while each case may be disputed, debunked, or buried under complexity, the emotional pattern is clear: fear, disappearance, denial. If there is a message to take from these tragedies, it isn't one of paranoia. It is a call for courage, for systems that protect whistleblowers instead of punishing them, for journalism that follows leads others abandon, for digital architectures that resist erasure, for public memory that refuses to forget. Because the real danger isn't just that powerful forces may silence truth, it's that we might stop noticing, or worse, that we might stop caring. These deaths should not be reduced to headlines or hashtags. They should remind us that information in the wrong hands becomes leverage, and that truth, when it challenges profit or power, is too often treated as a threat. So we end not with answers, but with a responsibility. To listen when others are silenced, to ask questions no one wants answered, to build a future where truth doesn't have to be encrypted, hidden, or carried in secret folders to a midnight meeting that never happens. Because the final, most human question of all is this: what kind of world do we leave behind when the price of telling the truth is your life? May we never grow numb to that question. May we never forget the stories that never got to be told. And may we become the ones who carry them forward.